Hello everybody, my name is Swaggy and I'm not late on this at all. Don't check when I posted this question. Previously, I asked all of you what were some unnecessarily restricted cards in Vanguard. You may notice I didn't make a video on that because I hated every answer I got. I'll try that again another time, maybe I'll be more clear on the questioning. So instead of hating, let's be nice. Though not always, sometimes Vanguard's card designers lock in and they make decks that are fun, reasonably powerful, and reward your individual skill. So, today I want to ask, what are some of the best designed decks in Vanguard? And my answer is here. Direful Doll Master Android and his Direful Dolls. This is like the ideal deck, right? It came out and was pretty cheap at the time. It has some decent offensive pressure at the time. It has a really unique guarding skill. You can get a lot out of this deck playing it casually or be pretty serious with the deck, and it still can do decently well even today. Even in the set 11 format, it's not that bad. It's got some decent plays. Direful Dolls is really special to me because when my partner was getting into Vanguard, this was the deck I passed to them. Like, this is the deck I thought would be the best fit for them. Because it doesn't really play itself, you do need a little bit of thinking, you have to know how to guard. And with just Direful Doll training, once she graduated from that, she got to be WGP Season 3 champion, and I am a loser still. So that's what happens when you play well-designed decks. So, let's see what you guys came up with. Drake Grazer says, personal favorite of mine, has a lot of utility, not reliant on expensive generics, and can give a second Vanguard swing that makes shield triggers useless for a turn. That can also now get a second drive check actually. She has her shortcomings, but she's a very interesting deck. I have to agree on Flam G. Flam Glam is a pretty cheap deck now. You don't really need any of the generics in Lyrical Monasterio like Francette or Eureka. You can just kind of play her as is with all the Flam Glam units. And she has a pretty reasonable amount of power. There's a lot you can do with getting 2 Vanguard swings with quad drive basically in a turn. It has some decision making points like how you use Counterblast early and how you make offensive lanes early. She's also a deck I recommend to newer players a lot because she's super cheap. You can pick up the whole core and just go to town. If you're good enough, you can get pretty far with the deck. There was a recent WGP, one of the Chiho Cups, that I think 3 Flam Glams made it to like top 16, and that was pretty fun to look at. So yeah, try it out if you haven't. This is a very interesting deck, and I think you'll learn a lot on the aggression side of Vanguard. Especially because the deck can kind of just go off on turn 2. Have you read Dive to Blue? That shit's crazy. Alicia says, at first res was this. People meme about Caterpillar and it eventually became pretty boring and straightforward, but early Rezael was an incredibly interesting and skill-intensive deck. Maximizing your value to delay the divine skill as long as possible was so much fun. I'll probably agree with that. Early Rezael I think I remember most for pressing the Minerva order and then drawing 2 and then calling T-Fault and thinking, wow, this shit is not fair. But yes, there is a lot of resource management that you learn with Rezael. His countercharger cost you a card in your hand. You could kind of deny him early counterblast because they were running the T-Fault package. A lot of the early decks in Divine Z were actually like this. You had a lot of decision points where you could do some counterplay to the opponent and they could fire back. There was this really cool balancing act you had to do with like thinking, oh, when am I gonna die? When can I hold out a bit more and not use the divine skill this early? It teaches like newer players how to manage their resources, including their damage. The deck has been streamlined quite a fair bit with Vita and all the Rezael cards that are crazy like Nilberis and Gabuelias, but for what it's worth, there was a time when this deck really did take a fair amount of pilot skill, especially in like the late game. Mei Changu says, I'm gonna put the answer that might get me killed and say Varga unironically. Truth nuke. Truth apocalypse. Varga is not a bad answer. It's one of those decks that reads pretty anga-banga, and that's fair, but it does reward your individual skill at managing resources like Counterblast. Knowing when to pull off the divine skill is a legitimate skill. Yes, it is very easy to boil it down to I'll check a critical trigger and then I'll press divine skill and win, but there is a lot of counterplay and play that both the Varga player and the Varga opponent can make to play around one another and have a really cool back and forth and interact. Varga is incredibly telegraphed, so if you are losing to Varga, a lot of that is kind of your fault, but the Varga player has some agency in doing things like holding divine skill, using divine skill as a way to accumulate resource rather than to take it away from you. It's even shown up in the anime where Nao uses the divine skill to get cards in her hand to live rather than to win. And for what it's worth, they have kind of designed Varga in a way where it's really difficult for them to just check yellow all the time. They don't really have hard filter. There's the dragon that like energy blasts 3 and checks top 5 to call 1, but that's almost not good enough in Varga. You'd rather be drawing cards, but if you draw cards, you might draw into triggers. It's a really well designed deck for what should reasonably just be Overlord at home, but they really put a lot of time into thinking about this. But whenever I lose to Varga, it's actually because my opponent got lucky and sacked me, and actually they took no skill at all, and actually I deserve to win that game. So wrong, and we will throw you to the hounds. Tanko says, what read as a gimmicky mess actually turned out to be a competent aggressive deck, and up until the newly revealed support, was the last usable 3 attack deck standing. Ooh, I filmed this really late. Wow, newly revealed support. That was weeks ago. Wow. That was pretty interesting. I think it only got noticed like a little bit after I think the Divine set was revealed. Then I started seeing some play in Japan. It's pretty competent, and honestly, it reads simple, but a lot of the difficulty comes in stuff like deck construction, like having a nice amount of orders to hit specific thresholds so that you still have units to do something with. It's about managing your drop zone so that you always have enough orders to hit that threshold. The aggression is really high theoretically because of the crit, but at the same time, it doesn't have 3 attacks, so everything is very telegraphed and you can play around all of it. It just is a little bit on the weaker side these days, but the new support is quite good. I wouldn't be surprised if the deck was good coming into that, but at the time, this was a pretty interesting deck. One of the things I remember most is that one of my first Divine Z locals ever, like when I was really getting back into the game, I was on like Virtualic Nis, and I played against Triple Trick Fennel in one of the later rounds, and I was thinking, this deck is ridiculous. He just draws 2 every turn, because I didn't want to go minus. But as it turns out, I could have just put my unit at the bottom of the deck and denied them the draw. So, you know, that was on me. But it's a cool thing, like, that's what a good design deck kind of is, right? When you can counterplay and you have a choice and you can deny your opponent a resource at the expense of something you can do. And that's kind of the fun of a lot of card games, just being able to do something in response to your opponent. This is just a picture of Night Rose. But yes, I get the idea. Yes, Night Rose is a very well designed deck, even in Standard. There's another answer here that also agrees with it. As a Zorga main, I have to admit that this deck has more cool and creative plays that people can experiment on, like using Soul Fronts on the field in the Nubitama matchup, and overall it is a deck that ceiling is determined by a player's skill level. Night Rose is a pretty skill intensive deck, knowing how to mill, knowing how to build the deck for the format. You know, do you think it's easy to check the top 5 cards of your deck with Obadiah and get the exact piece you're missing? No, it's intense on resource management, both in terms of cards in hand and cards in your deck, because you are going through your deck really fast sometimes. You can tech your deck a lot more either aggressively or more, you know, kind of control-y. With Harvest Elf, for example, with the early Elvina turns. There are a lot of diverging paths in deck building that then convert to the deck's converging plays when you know, pilot the deck. It's also a stride deck in 2025, which means it's automatically based and cool. You know, even last format Night Rose had success, and since it's getting a new promo, you know, it probably could see a big comeback into the meta if people get really creative with how they want to use the freed resources thanks to the order. It's just a shame Hari isn't on this list, right? Like, that deck's, you know, if this deck is well designed, then Hari is designed. Jail. You are going to jail for this answer. Jail. But no, Zorga is, and I don't like saying it, a very well-designed deck. You know, knowing what orders to play and what turns to do it on is a skill. The deck doesn't technically really build itself because you have a lot of different ways you can build the deck. You can kind of build the deck in a more control-y variant for a while. There are mid-range builds. There was even some aggro lists back in the day, you know, when you had nothing. The Divine Skill is a skill check, Living is a skill check. You know, if Zorga players were normal about Zorga, this would be a pretty well-received deck in the format, I feel. But because the deck is so well-designed, Zorga players are not normal about Zorga. I think that is a showing as to how interestingly the deck is designed. Frequently, you do have to kind of think a couple turns ahead on the deck, otherwise you're not going to have an order to play, or you're not going to have the right thing to alchemy magic. Plus, it is cool that every time we see a Zorga top, the list is completely different from the last guy in the same format. And with Remain Smasher, I'm surprised we don't see more success with this deck. I believe there's one top 8 in Taiwan if we get those results like published. I would look out for this deck even in this format, and if you're looking for something really interesting and skill testing to pilot, I would recommend Zorga Nadir. You know, I will go to bat for Lord. In the same vein as Night Rose, Luard is also a pretty well designed deck. It takes a fair amount of skill to pilot, the deck doesn't build itself anymore, and you're always at a disadvantage playing stride decks now. But the drag driver resource game is skill intensive for the player involved. There are a couple techs in the deck that you might want to think about that you could reasonably include or not include depending on the metagame, like the Flip Attack Perfect Guard, the Undercover card that kind of last one to search for a Shadow Paladin. I don't think every build plays that. There are some builds that focus on the Blitz Order that gives you shield, calling the, I believe, heal triggers back from your drop zone. It's overall a pretty well designed deck, all things considered. And I think it's quite the testament to how well Dragheart Lord stood the test of time since G era, that the Ritual 3 skill is, you know, it's always good. Getting this much advantage over time, being the only stride deck that doesn't have to run a ton of grade 3s is a big advantage. But I'm still mad that Luard has overtaken Claret Sword as the G-era Shadow Paladin representative. So I hate this answer and I'm sad now. What a surprise, yet another deck from DZBT01 that is considered well designed. Lascaria is like Dolls' more defensive sister. She plays on a really interesting axis with the Blitz Orders and has some pressure still thanks to her restanders and crit. She has a really good resource game that she can play with the new respawner. You're trying to find a way to maximize your offense in a deck with pretty limited offense, all things considered. It used to be you could just run the Nectar Order and kill your opponent with the restander, but now you can't, which is a big shame because that was a lot of what the deck did. But it's still a great deck, especially to teach newer players. I love using this deck as an example because it's fairly cheap and you can play a really long grind game. Again, this is one of the decks that I showed my partner at the start of her Vanguard career because I thought it was such a good deck in teaching you the guard step, which is one of the most important parts about Vanguard. Looking back on this, I mean, DCBTO1, just nothing but bangers, all things considered. 47 Haven says, I personally vouch for Cloudwater, Shoujo Doji, and Veleno. Well, we've covered Veleno, so we'll look at Doji. Doji just works so well with the archetype he's in, enabling so many toolbox options. I agree. Shoujo Doji is one of the best designed decks in Vanguard right now. You know, maybe he was a little bit overtuned when set 3 came out, but he really is a very skill-intensive deck. You know, you can learn a fair bit. There are a lot of diverging combo lines you can take. There are options both to play kind of more mid-rangey, slower games, like making 4 attacks or 5 attacks a turn, versus maybe making a bigger wombo combo later in the game. You have access to a lot of your deck basically on command, thanks to the binding and the top 5 searches of Izaso, so you can always have the right guard or the persona ride. You're always kind of tested in managing the resources both in your bind zone and your soul, and despite the fact that it is a lot weaker, the deck still has pretty recent tops. The deck can mostly be played in-engine. That's a really good sign of a well-designed deck, that it plays very well with the cards that it's meant to play with rather than a bunch of generics. There's one player at the university locals I frequent who always brings Shoujo Doji, and I swear on my life that man has like Psyqualia. It's just that deck wants him to win. He'll check crits when he needs to, you know, he always has everything he needs in the bind zone, but I imagine that's because he's very comfortable with the deck and he's just piloting it very well, that it makes it look very seamless. Because I know for a fact, when I tried learning Shoujo Doji, I was shit. So yeah, really like Shoujo Doji as an answer. Alright, here on YouTube, I want to highlight M. Holmes' answer here of Mythiarch, because I love Mythiarch and I think it's very well designed, you know, in standard. Whatever happens in premium, you know, that's your circus, not my monkeys. I want to talk about standard Mythiarch, which is a really fun, aggressive deck. Managing the Mythiarchs you have on your board in your hand, Lurusu's call skill helps you build boards really easily and can also, you know, the hand rip feels quite fair even in standard. It's a deck that I'm surprised doesn't do better. I feel like the deck is decent at least. Set 6 giving you Mythachart, I believe his name is one of the biggest boons to the deck because it just gives you access to so many Mythiarchs at once, gives you a high shield value. Mythiarch teaches you the importance of like getting aggressive early, maintaining units on board, how to make sure that you can always have 5 on board even when your opponent is doing stuff like retiring your units. I just love Mythiarch so much. I don't know, I don't even know if it's particularly well designed. I mean, hand rips are, you know, hand rips. And it's not particularly good. I just wanted to talk about Mythiarch for a second, leave me alone. Fishball Bobo says, to me it is Arcalibra. Simple playstyle but incredibly fun for me. Setting up huge columns without much cost and playing very much in archetype makes it feel like barraging my opponent with cannons. Personally, I hate Arcalibra because it's boring, but I do see the appeal because at one point I didn't find it boring. It's decently well designed in that despite the fact that the power goes really high, it is kind of balanced. Even though it can do multi-attack and stuff, it never has like overwhelming amounts of critical or anything. Everything is reasonably costed. It's well designed in that it does what it wants to do very well. If you're the type of player who really likes making big numbers and doing flashy things like getting plus 15k off one skill, zapping your opponent for a point of damage as your divine skill, then, you know, this deck is great for you. It's not well designed in that I think it's particularly good, but it is well designed in that it does its conceit very well, if that makes sense. The theming is very well on point, the people who like it for a very good reason. It can make really nice multi-attacks now, and a lot of it is played with just the overcharge units. It's actually very cheap too. I would recommend Akalira if you want a cheaper deck as well. Sky with Pup says, for me it's definitely Dual Majestar Astroya for sure. It basically has multiple interesting ways to use the deck, and when I saw the Twinkling Stars in the episode, it just spoke to me for using that deck, Lamau. Astroya is a deck that I think is kind of underrated. I don't think it's amazing, but I think it's a lot better than we give it credit for. The consistent persona rights it has now is really cool. It can often make pretty nice numbers with high crit. When it removes crits from the game, I think your opponent kind of imagines the fact that you have filtered a bunch of crits out, when in reality you haven't. So it's kind of a skill check to, check your opponent's drop zone and make sure of everything. It has some board interference. It's very well designed in that I think giving a deck access to very consistent persona riding is something you have to kind of thread the needle on carefully, because persona ride is a broken mechanic. But the deck does it in a fashion that never feels too unfair. It's not the fastest deck in the format, but when it gets going, it really gets going. And of course the theming is very cool. A shame it never got an anime character though, that's weird. It's a shame that nobody in the anime plays it. Nobody of relevance. Nobody plays this deck. So, what have you learned from this? Divine Z Set 1 of Vanguard is perfect in every way, shape, and form. Frequently, a lot of the best designed decks in Vanguard allow for skill expression on both players' ends, whether it is you as the opponent playing around something the deck does, or whether it is you as a pilot making important and meaningful decisions to get the maximum output out of your deck. The decks tend to be a reasonable power and fulfill a very specific theme or niche that a lot of players will connect with. And for what it's worth, it does help that the deck is very affordable and plays a lot in engine. And it does seem to resonate a lot more with players if you don't rely on a bunch of generics to make your deck's engine start. Alright, that's it from me. Bye bye!